we can move into the Q&A and open discussion. So we want this to be interactive. So the questions that are lined up here are there to be answered, and we'll capture your feedback, but it's also a seed for discussion. And we have a little bit more than a half hour. We have something like 40 minutes to have the discussions. So it's really the core of this forum where we want to get your opinion about things. So we'll start with this poll here, and some of you, most of you, I think, are used to the process by now. In order to respond to the poll, please go to the link that is listed up there, pollev.com/ASWF, on any device, a phone, tablet, your computer, and you will be able to access you will see a version of these questions. In previous year, we knew the Oscar nomination by the time of our forum. We don't know them this year, so I looked at the predictive list of some of the outfits out there, and there we go. Somebody voted for Mank. So the list is not accurate, but it's a sampling, and we're about 50 people on the forum at the moment. So if you can all give it a shot, and once we have 30 of you who figured it out, we'll move on to the next question. This is not binding. We will not check if our Academy Software Foundation predictions were accurate.
You said prediction, but then you said who should win. Those are two totally different things, David.
You're right. I did that on purpose to confuse everyone on this first question to get our creative juice flowing. Yeah. Nobody liked Mank. That's interesting. All right, we need 5 more people to come in and contribute an answer. This is the part where you need to stop multitasking and start focusing on the forum. If you don't, we'll be stuck on this slide for like many minutes. 3 more people. Come on, come on. Do I have to go and put an answer myself?
I'm going to make an incognito browser pretty soon.
Right. Okay. I'll call it good enough. Okay. It looks like I may not have the control here. Hold on a second. Ah, there we go. Here's our first question. We ask that question every time, so we want to poll your opinion. How did the foundation perform in the last year, according to your expectation? Totally intuitive question. The last year was very disrupted, obviously, and it's fair to say that we all had our mind on our own business in a more intense way than usual. All right. That is good. And from memory, we went down a little bit from last year, which we can attribute to many in terms of the performing beyond expectation or as expected.
Or higher expectations, David.
Possibly. Yeah, that's true. We will be analyzing this result endlessly and comparing it to previous year. And going into more specifics now, few issues. Hold on a second. I'll give you more seconds. We have 33 answers on this, so that's good. All right. So here's our classic question that we also ask every year. As for where we are now, please list the open source project that will be good candidates for the foundation. So we've asked the question. We're asking it again to see how your thinking is evolving. If there has been new projects that have come in that you've seen coming up, I'll give you the time to. So we have our classic answer to our classic question. USD coming up on top. Material X.
I would love to learn. I know a lot of these. I would love to learn a little bit more about Zoe from whomever. I was just Googling it. Oh, it's already a Linux Foundation project. Even better. Somebody want to indicate why they're campaigning that it would be good to fold in? You don't have to if you're not comfortable, but. It looks like it's actually part of the Open Mainframe project in the Linux Foundation, which, so in theory, we would be only half a step away from being able to strategize with them if there were some relevant connections for our industry. So feel free to email us offline or email Kimball if you'd like, if you'd rather not speak up here.
All right.
It's great to see Material X on here. Certainly an open source library that could easily be targeted for this. Does anybody want to speak up as to a why there? Other than it would just be a nice home for it, since maybe you're starting to think about leveraging it.
I mean, one thing, Rob, from the studio technology perspective that's a little different is just we work with so many different vendors across the industry that having it be open source would help with different collaborations with software vendors or a variety of different visual effects or post vendors. So from that's from my perspective.
And just to be clear, it is already open sourced, but it is not part of. It's not hosted by the foundation yet. Yeah, but that is not out of the question at all. Something we could do.
All right.
Does anyone want to volunteer to be the one to build the Linux distro to get that one started? That's a sizable chunk of work, but I like it.
No, but I'll confess to put that on there because that's going to be something for discussion later. I don't necessarily think that's a reasonable project for the German Software Foundation to do, but I think there's work to be done in that space.
It's certainly the kind of project that would benefit from a shared ecosystem of people doing it, because it's a bigger job than any one of us would probably take on our own. But it might not be an unreasonable job to do as a community if we felt that the other distros weren't a good enough match, or maybe a variation on an existing distro was the right match.
Just out of curiosity, would that be sort of, I think CentOS was fairly heavily used in this industry. Is that sort of a follow on because of the shift that community did?
That shift certainly has inspired more discussion, and it's causing studios to reevaluate which Linux distro they're using. And I think a lot of Linux distros are really not optimizing for high-end desktop work anymore. It's either for servers or general office productivity. And while it's not an issue maybe for us right now, I can see 5 to 10 years down the line, like there's a sustainability issue there. And is this an opportunity for us to kind of get ahead of that and start working together more as an industry? So just with my VFX reference platform hat on, That's
Yeah.
something that we're planning to, in the VS Tech Committee, been talking about this. It's something we're planning to write a sort of paper on over the next kind of couple of months, I hope, just to kind of spur some discussion over the kind of conferences, as we get into the conference season, because I think there is an opportunity there for I think the industry and the community to pull together in the same direction and help steer us towards a more sustainable workstation, Linux workstation distro. And maybe the Academy Software Foundation, particularly with the relationship with Linux Foundation, may have a role to play in that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like that.
and I don't know if Larry, if you want to speak up, but with the presentation that Sony did of things like SPFS and SPK that they did at the CI working group, with projects like that, where you're starting to blur the line between OS and not, it may make a lot of sense to really talk about that. So.
I'm not quite sure what you want me to say about it.
I didn't know
we're exploring collaboration on that.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said also about Linux having obviously a big role to play in the backend and cloud streaming part of industries, and some vendors have efforts on that side. So Linux is always and has been growing as a platform to support. But when it comes to the workstation aspect, there seems to be always some drivers and some particular hardware that is not readily available as from other platforms. So having a more unified voice for our film industry around Linux could be valuable. It's a good one. It's a new one on our list. Good thing. Any other comments about?
We've talked about Res a number of times. I'm curious. Since I only know a little bit about it, has anyone already reached out to them? Are the maintainers in a situation where they feel like we could bring them useful value, or have we even investigated that yet? Because it always comes up around here in our list of priorities to think about.
Yeah, and one thing to note, while we do make these lists as often as we can, it's up to the projects to decide when they're ready to or that they feel like they could benefit, and so.
We're not a group that does hostile takeovers of open source projects or branches them. We're just in the mode of supporting them, to your point, Kimball.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, Rob or Kimball, if we could just talk about that process for people that maybe have projects and how to go about approaching it. I thought that might be a good subject in terms of, hey, I have something, I'm thinking about it. How do I go about doing this?
Yeah. There's actually a form online that you can fill out. And we try to make the intake process as straightforward as possible. It's not particularly complicated, but you do want to have a sense of what is involved. And if you need someone or want someone to just kind of walk you through the processes, you could talk to any of the people who are maintaining current projects, because all of the maintainers of the current projects have walked through that process, going from a project that they already had open source and migrating it into the Academy. Things like the CIA badge and those other things have been questions that people have, like, what does it mean for my project to have these new requirements on it? And we can walk you through how the requirements are implemented, how you can get extra resources to help solve some of these things, so you don't have to just take it all on your current maintainers. And I'd say either work with an existing project maintainer or reach out to Kimball and the TAC, because they can walk you through what that process is, provide advice and input. And then once you submit, it's not like there's a two-way evaluation, right? You have to decide as the submitter that you think probably would be a good fit. And then the TAC has to decide whether they recommend that it's a good fit for as well. Because we want to stay focused on our industry. We want to stay focused on tools where we can really bring value. So there's that evaluation process, but that's designed to be completely transparent. The submitter can come to those meetings, hear the discussion, participate, and then the TAC makes a recommendation up to the governing board and says, yeah, we should take this one. We think we should take this one on. The governing board makes sure we can afford to, basically, and gives a thumbs up. So that's the rough process. There's some online documentation for that, which we can point people to. Actually, John, maybe you can even paste it into the chat, the main landing page for submitting a project in terms of the forms and stuff, because there are forms to fill out. But that's kind of the small part. It's big. It's much more about the discussion.
Rob makes it sound very advanced. There is effectively a document where you answer a bunch of questions, and that's sort of the initial start to it. I think when I did the raw to ACES one, I think it took me I don't know, an hour or so to sort of go through and answer the questions. And really what that is just a means to start the conversation. And to answer to Steve's question in the chat, I think that the things that we look for are projects that either have value to the wider community and are suffering and need support, or ones, but we can certainly support plenty of projects that have active community members already, and all that you're then, well, not all, what you're then getting is this sort of wider community of visibility. And we probably would have to change the format of our updates if we had 100 projects, but I don't think that there's any sort of arbitrary limit that we have on the number of active projects. I think we have the resources to handle quite a number.
That's great to hear. When we initially started, there were some constraints, figuring out how a lot of this would work on the number of projects we initially took on. So it was just more of an update on that.
Yeah, I think we've streamlined the build stuff such that we thought we were going to originally have a huge cost to supporting the build infrastructure. But I think that we've sort of found a good balance of how to manage that and how to have that be not such a financial burden as we thought it might have been originally. And then so it would just be more about maintenance and making sure we're helping the project as much as the project is benefiting.
Yeah, we're actively, you saw in that slide, we're actively imagining 3 more projects this year. That would make sense. If it was 4, that'd be fine too. And we're not bound by the cost, as Kimball pointed out. And we actually have, one of the great things is we have so many sponsors now in our group, and we anticipate growing that, both general members and premier members. Each of those groups has already promised to dedicate at least 1 full-time employee, or an equivalent of a full-time person. It might be 2 different people split up or 10 different people split up. But there's sponsoring organizations who are looking where to put those resources on Academy Software Foundation projects right now. So we right now have room to add more engineering days to projects. So yeah, it's kind of a perfect time to onboard some new ambitious work.
Is there a view, Rob, on where the resources currently are allocated and where the gaps are?
It's actually a topic of discussion. If you recall, when we formed the foundation just over 2 years ago, we actually gave everybody a 2-year window to just say, contribute your full-time employee to your full-time equivalent to any open source project, because we didn't have any projects on day one. And we knew we were only going to have a small handful of projects in the first couple of years. We're just at the end of that window now, where 2 years have now passed. So now, in theory, everyone should redirect their FTEs to Academy Software Foundation projects. Now, there has to be enough work to do. And this isn't the kind of thing where the Academy Software Foundation dictates to any of our sponsoring organizations where you have to put your FTE. Everybody gets to scratch their own itch. You get to decide where you put that person. But the TAC is the place that identifies where we have areas of need, and then can say like, oh, hey, does anybody have a resource that could help with this? And that's the whole strength of the organization, is being able to identify those, sweep in, offer additional resources by highlighting these issues, and make sure that the companies and the sponsors and the community that is most affected and interested in those problems can jump in and help out with those. But right now, it's not very formalized at all.
We are going to start asking those questions to our members.
Oops, I think we might have lost David, or I did at least. But yes, it's an active area of discussion. Oh, hopefully he'll be back soon, because he's got the poll.
And in the project, okay, we're looking for. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
I
It's
did
good.
not
We
hear
only
you.
lost you for
Do you hear me?
5-10 seconds.
Okay. All right. So maybe it's a sign. We need to move to the next slide. As we do on this topic, what I wanted to mention is that in the second part of our forum, where presenters from the Linux Foundation are going to present to us, there's also going to be hints of how there are certain projects that create a lot of synergies and contribution from the industry that will happen. And Hyperledger, for instance, is a project that hundreds and hundreds of engineers were dedicated to because there was a clear and present need for that technology in that industry. So it's also something that we want to keep in mind, that this can happen. It has happened in other industries, could happen in ours as well. And then it's beyond the FTEs that companies have committed to. It is really all hands on deck because we need to do this all together. So the kind of project that could be coming up as well. Let me try to move this. All right, so we're changing context switch. This is a question about non-code open source project. So you've heard about movie data or asset repository, and you've not heard about a diversity and inclusion open charter on this update, but this is also a topic that is being discussed within the diversity and inclusion. And so we want to poll you into your thought about the foundation hosting projects and creating projects that would be based on the open source principle, but would not be code. And we've already done this poll internally at the board level, but we wanted to bring it to you also, our friends and families and people we trust. There are two sides to this equation. We were clearly the foundation was clearly put together to host open source software and code, and we're all structured for that. But we are coming across these opportunities for asset, and in the case of the diversity and inclusion, the idea of an open charter that was brought to us by Adobe as a new member. I don't think Bill is with us today, but in a nutshell, the idea there is that companies, as Rob mentioned, many companies, most companies have developed their own diversity and inclusion or representation and equality programs internally. And they're all different, and they all have different flavors. So it looks a bit like custom code. Everyone has one, and it's all different. And there are companies, maybe smaller companies, who also want to develop that sort of diversity and inclusion sensibility, but don't have the resource to set up a department or even permanent people, and may want to adopt a charter that already exists and that is modified over time in a way that is similar to the way source code is modified over time.
So one example of something that could go in such a charter, or could be a fragment in such a project, is something that we've done at Disney. So we've worked for quite a while actually with our legal team to have an inclusion rider in our visual effects awards, and it is slowly being implemented across all of Disney, Marvel, and Lucasfilm projects. And slowly, I say only because we wanted to give all of the vendors who work for us time to implement and comply. But the idea is there's 5 metrics that you have to already have in place to continue to be awarded visual effects work from the Disney companies. And they're achievable. And they went through quite a long process to be written and vetted by the legal teams. So just the fact that these 5 examples exist and there's legal language that's going to be going into Disney contracts might be a useful jumping off point if someone wanted to implement a similar inclusion rider, or someone just wanted to be able to point to their lawyers and say, like, other companies have been able to do this. I think we should be able to do something similar. That's just one example. The team from Adobe and Bill had done a fantastic presentation on some of their efforts, some of which I thought would be fantastic for us to implement at our company, and a neutral forum for sharing that kind of information, even if in fragments, could be really interesting. It is a little bit outside of the specific open source charter, but it's very consistent with our DNI working group, which has had really broad support and I think has been a unique way that we can contribute back to the industry, but worth chatting about very specifically.
There's a few people who have said possibly, or I don't think so. If you wanted to share your opinion, that would be very valuable in that.
Yeah, I mean, I put possibly just because that's a pretty wide range of things, and I think it would depend on which of them they are. So I think not to speak too much for everyone else who put possibly, but it's like you want to say yes, but there may be some particular projects or resources where it might make less sense, or be, like to Rob's earlier point, be less beneficial for this body to tackle that issue.
Makes sense. Thank you for that. So I think our takeaway is that there's a positive sentiment, but we need to be more specific than just a question about what the project would be. And I think there probably would be a lot good work to do to define the mechanism, because we have them down for software by now, but for other form of assets or content, we need to define them. So it makes sense. Positive sentiment recorded. Okay, now here's a wide one. Share your thoughts about the challenges and opportunities for the film industry after the pandemic disruption. And that would be very wide. And we want to narrow that question about what can we do about it within the foundation. So this year there was the pandemic that created havoc and changes and disruptions and opportunities in the year. What are they, particularly from the point of view of the foundation? In your work every day that you've seen, and everyone in this forum has had to adapt their work to a new way of working. Is there something the foundation can do in our open source model to help our industry beyond what we've already been talking about so far? Think about where we were a year ago and meeting in person at the Academy Museum, and where we are now and how things have evolved.
It's right now, I think it's useful to think about that one that's bubbling to the top. Don't stop adding new ones, because I think other things will bubble to the top. I've been very involved in content security guidelines at a couple different places. My initial thought is the Academy Software Foundation wouldn't be a good place to advocate for long-term guidelines, since that's going to be driven by probably MPAA and the way that they distribute that out to their organizations. And I don't know if we want to be what's the right name for one of those organizations. I don't know whether or not we want to take our eye off of contributing on open source and turn to what tends to be a very political choice of political discussion about what the right trade-off is between security and and production flexibility. And those are really important discussions. And of course, we collectively have opinions about that and could represent them as a body, but I wonder how important it is. Like, we have the right people in the room, but is it the right focus for the Academy Software Foundation is my question. I'm happy to hear the counter argument, by the way.
We're largely a technical body, and I could imagine us contributing to the technical side of that conversation, sort of as, similar to the Union of Concerned Scientists commenting on a policy idea.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this ties in a bit to the prior question, which speaks to whether we're looking to identify the ASWF as a body that takes on non-code based initiatives, working groups, what have you. And so to that end, if we are expecting or thinking that could include guidance around security, like technical approaches to security concerns, and have that be something we take on, I think it dovetails with the prior question.
Yeah.
On the content security guidelines specifically, I think there's also some other bodies who are doing work in the area, in related areas or directly, like Movie Labs or ETC or VES. There's some others already tackling some aspects and retooling, based on the work from home pandemic changes. So it may not make sense for that reason as well.
I could see the VES, for example, making a strong pitch to allow for better work-life balance for visual effects artists and being able to come in with a very strong opinion. I could see us, to Eric's point, providing a strong technical point of view about how to do that securely or how to improve security, or even have a project that does specific things related to specific security concerns. But I think it would be harder for us to take a strong point of view about, from one perspective or the other, either from the studio perspective, which might be inclined to be more restrictive, or from the a vendor or an artist perspective, or an engineer perspective that might be inclined to be less restrictive but more flexible.
To that end, do we have any precedent for collaborating with other bodies on joint efforts? Like I could see us, for example, working with VES or even Movie Labs on their 30-year vision as relates to content security guidelines, and us helping to provide either actual projects that we can implement that have real code in order to assist in certain aspects of that, whereas we rely on those other bodies for their thought leadership and other kind of soft motions. Is that, I know it's a loaded question, but is that something that would fit with our mandate and give us an opportunity to drive collaborations?
Yes.
I think the VFX reference platform is probably a good example of that relationship, including with the CI/CD group, and essentially setting the standard and then addressing from a software foundation point of view how you apply it, what are the software projects you encourage around it. And I think what Rob said around the security side makes sense, where the VES Tech Committee has dabbled in some aspects of security guidelines, as well as during COVID, kind of the repository for some of the information of what solutions people are leveraging. And I can imagine there being a point where an open source or a set of open source projects can actually help shore up content security in one way or another, or facilitate work from home. And that's where the Software Foundation would come into play, based on kind of working groups on the VES side, partnering with the MPA and other bodies that would drive the kind of hard requirements and constraints that we have to operate under.
That makes sense. We have part of our associate members. We have now many groups like the VES and others who are also part of our foundation, who took notice of our work on open source, like the ETC, for instance, the Entertainment Technology Center of USC think tank. And SIMT is also a member now of our foundation, because open source is becoming a thing for them. And instead of creating from scratch something new. They joined us, and there's a potential for collaboration. I wouldn't say that we have collaborated a lot with these organizations at this time. We focused on our core work, but for topics like that one, if there was something we can do from our part to work with others, we're set up for that with our associate members potentially.
So to comment briefly on it, can see a case where there are things that maybe the Software Foundation might not want to take on, but can see a need that directly relates to technology to empower some of the things that you would otherwise try to do. So to amplify on what Eric had said, I think having a way that the foundation could call for an industry, voice or activity without actually being the place where it gets done, that could actually turn out to be important and something to be considered, I think.
That makes sense. Thank you for that. Great.
A little further down the list, somebody said a facilitator slash vetting for internal approval of open source use requests. I have an idea what that might be, but I wondered if whomever contributed that or voted on it might want to elaborate a little bit.
That was me, Kerry Phillips. The life of a modern software engineer is navigating a maze of dependencies between open source packages, all of which require some kind of internal legal approval before use. And that use can often be, that approval can often take months of back and forth with, interacting with your internal legal department that is overwhelmed with requests and all of that. If there's any way that the foundation could serve as a kind of clearinghouse of stamp of approval on licensing for open source projects.
Yeah, I know that one of our ideas by having the consistent licensing language or as consistent as possible licensing languages in our projects would be like, hey, if it's an Academy Software Foundation project, it's easy to adopt. But I think what you're saying is, could that go one step further? Could there be another 40 libraries that the Academy Software Foundation has looked at and said, like, these licensing terms are substantially similar to ours? If we could do something like that, would that make it easier for organizations to adopt open source libraries and patterns into their workflow? That's a really interesting idea and a big project.
I wonder if a related idea is a similar open charter to help these companies set up their own open source program office that can kind of have an organized way to expedite like the process that they use internally for use, contribution, and sponsoring of projects, which sometimes can, like, it can take a long time to get one's own company to kind of turn that into a reliable process, and maybe there's some knowledge that can be shared there between the companies, and that any one company's legal department can see, oh, these other 8 companies decided this thing was safe to do, we should do that too.
Yes, and we have a segment about open source program office coming up. Larry,
yeah.
Good intro to that.
And I think something like that would be a requirement before we could do anything like that Linux distribution project. So it's a good thing to think about.
Very good. We have 3 minutes left, if I got that right, in our Q&A period. And so we're going to end with the general question. Is there any other topic that we have not covered in this open discussion so far that you would like to bring to our attention? And that is the place where anything that we have that we have not covered is the time to bring it up. Or if you want to double click on on a topic that we've brought in the presentation that we had this morning? And if not, no other topic, we can take a 2-minute break and be back with the second part of our forum, which will be hosted by John Murtick. We do have something coming up.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. The second one came up about should we just employ software engineers directly to contribute to projects? It's really, we don't see it as our primary way of supercharging these projects. Our sponsors, our members can contribute as many hours, engineering hours, and other hours that are necessary to bring these projects to life as makes sense. And our job is to facilitate that and to supercharge those hours. So when you spend an hour doing work, it's really valuable time spent, and to try to facilitate the cross-platform communication, all those other things. If we take our budget that is substantial for those things, which right now is about $1 million a year, and started hiring engineers, you know how few engineers that would be, and then that would spend most of our resources. So we have the whole idea about the open source structure is to find the sponsors that want to contribute those hours and to facilitate that, to make that healthy industry, but not necessarily to go scratching our itches as a foundation, but rather let our members contribute what makes the most sense there. It's a really good question, though. And it's not to say that we would never hire an engineer to do an hour of coding or at all, because if there was a huge bottleneck and everyone was waiting on it and none of our sponsoring organizations or any of our people in our community had that expertise, we could unblock it with some money if necessary. But that would probably be the exception in terms of the most efficient way to structure everyone's contributions. If you look at the amount of money people put in compared to the amount of value people are putting in terms of hours, the bigger contribution is absolutely the number of hours, and that's what we're trying to optimize everything for. I love the idea of focusing on real time. Such a big area, and how we can best facilitate that.
Depending upon what the focus is, there's an existing project in Linux Foundation, Real-Time Linux, that maybe there's some tie-ins there. I don't know kind of the space. It's not
the same. We're talking about real-time 3D rendering.
Oh, gotcha.
And they're about that real-time operating system, which is awesome, but not
the same.
Really the same. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, no worries.
But does anybody who upvoted that or wrote it want to chat a little bit about what they are thinking too, and how we might be able to most contribute?
Yeah, so I just added that one. I think it's just a really exciting area in the industry at the moment, and there's just, as you say, there's so many possibilities to explore. And at Access, we're really keen to kind of deep dive into different ways that we can incorporate real-time engine technology into different parts of our production process, seeing how we can really innovate in those areas. So I think it'd be a really exciting kind of area to explore in the academy as well.
That's great.
In an environment that is very dynamic, the challenge is to identify pieces that can be open source in the early days. It's perhaps the OpenEXR challenge. That was done right with OpenEXR. There was a number of features that were identified as key that everybody would use, and that could be open sourced. And what's happening now with the explosion of real-time technologies is to finding that those libraries that identify them is the challenge when everything is changing so fast. All right. Well, we're 2 minutes over. So in the 30 seconds, John, I'll give you back the deck. so that you can proceed with the second segment of our forum.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, David. This first session has been really, really good. Thank you, everyone who has participated, provided some feedback and ideas. I know this is giving the entire project things to chew on. Let me go ahead and take back screen control here.